Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is December 9th, 2019. Glad you could join us for this topic. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about the season of gift giving, the season of gifts. I'm using that really as a platform to talk about the idea of giving and getting and giving and loving and needing. And I think there's some things I really am excited about this topic because I don't think it's common sense. It's taken me a lot of years to kind of sort through some of these ideas and this information, and particularly because I think today there's so much that gets talked about in pop culture with the idea of intimacy, and this really speaks to the heart of intimacy. First, I'll start with this quote from her book, Letters of Juliet to the Knight in Rusty Armor by J.D. Gill. She says, at one point in the story, the wife of the knight says, "It was so hard for me, my dear knight, to admit that I had brought others what I wanted, not what they wanted. I called this caring or nurturing before." Again, a fundamental element of our healthy or unhealthy codependency is our ability to see clearly what it means to give and what is for the other and when we are taking. In our codependency, and again, I like to point out often that that's a pop psychology term for poor attachment, a lack of healthy intimacy. In our codependency, we confuse giving and getting all the time. We confuse loving and needing all the time. And we ask for things from other people without knowing it at all. So again, I'm going to go through this information tonight. Let's talk about the idea in therapy. In fact, one of the earliest things that I learned about in my training to become a therapist was the idea of gifts. They talked about it in family systems theory, in contrast to contracts, where there's an exchange of promised or agreed upon gifts that we would give back and forth to each other, or things that we give back and forth to each other. That could be actions, of course, or behaviors. That's a contract, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Gifts, in the therapeutic sense, are things that we give without any strings attached. And I mean really without any strings attached. For all of us, myself included, I often think that I'm not attaching an expectation to the gift, but then I find myself upset, disappointed, resentful when I didn't get at least the reaction that I wanted. So the idea of therapeutic gifts is it's given from a place of abundance, but it's given freely without anything expected in return. And we don't have to give these things, right? These are things that we give from a place of abundance, from a place of capacity, from a place of a secure sense of self. One of the things that often gets asked of me by parents as they're doing their work, sometimes by partners in a couple, is they'll say to me, with a particular skill, it didn't work. And what I'll tease apart or unwind often is I wasn't suggesting, we weren't talking about that skill or that tool, that idea, so that you would get a reaction from the other person. We were talking about it because the idea was to express love, affection, warmth, support for somebody else, to be assertive, to be clear, to be authentic, right? All of those are innate in the act. Don't don't necessarily ask or require something in return. So therapeutic gifts are really giving without a string attached, without something expected in return. Um, One of the ways that you know, again, is by your reaction. You don't know sometimes, at least I don't. I assume it's true with virtually everybody because I've seen it with virtually everybody I've met. Um, you don't know until afterwards, until you have an expectation. I had a friend, a colleague of mine one time, whose son was struggling with substance abuse. And he said, in response, he said that he had given up alcohol. He didn't think that he had a problem with alcohol, but he wanted to do it in solidarity, in support of his son. And then when his son relapsed, he found himself feeling resentful. And I said to him, we were having this dialogue. He was asking me the question. I said, "It sounds like you were doing that with an expectation. It wasn't really a gift from a generous place." And he stopped and he said, I hadn't thought about it. I didn't think at the time that I was doing it with an expectation, but I was. So those feelings that come afterwards, they can remind us of that. Like I said, the ability or inability to give a gift of love, or from a place of love, I should say, is rooted in our codependency and our attachment. Like, has it been modeled for us? And so many of us can talk about in our families. In my family, it could be talked about examples where somebody says they're giving, but you can feel something else. It's one of the strongest reactions that people have in therapy that I've seen in my career. When a loved one, parent sometimes, or it could be a spouse, when a loved one says that I'm giving this freely, and yet everybody in the system knows it's coming with expectations. I always say it's if you gave the gift, whatever it is, the time, the object, the words, if you gave it, and the person's response was to virtually, metaphorically, crumple it up and throw it in the garbage, would that be okay? And if the answer is yes, then it's a gift by definition. In contrast to gifts, we talk about in systems, family systems theory, we talk about contracts. Like I said, contracts are mutual agreements where each party agrees to give in exchange for something. Right? If you get these grades, I'm willing to give you this computer, buy you this computer for your next school year. If you do these chores, you can have this fee. If you're home on time, you can earn the privilege to go out later at night, whatever it is. Right? It's kind of that contractual thing. Again, resentment. When we feel resentment, it's because we're probably not executing our part, our limit in the contract. I've told this story, but I'm going to tell it again. In fact, the painting is I'm looking right across from me. My son gave me a painting. He's an artist, and he painted something for me years ago. Beautiful painting that I love enough that I stare at it every day. And when we were living in our last home, because it's such a large painting, it takes up a large part of a wall. It's a major part of the decor in that room. So my son asked if he could borrow it for an art show that he was participating in. So I said, sure, of course. I said, I'll need it back by such and such a date because we're showing the house. This is before we moved. And the date was approaching, and I called my son. He lives about 40 minutes away. And I said, hey, I need the painting back. And he explained that his friend who had the car big enough to fit it in was out of town and that he couldn't get it back. So I hung up the phone. I walked into my bedroom where my wife was getting ready, and I just started to kind of spill my resentment. And I started to think, maybe even say things like, we pay for his college. He was in college at the time. We pay for his college. We help support him. And I let him borrow this, and I just need him to bring it back. And I realized as the words that were coming out of my mouth, this was my problem, not his. I didn't demand it. I didn't set a boundary with it. I didn't let him know that if I didn't get it back, that the next time he asked, he wasn't going to get it. And in fact, I would have had to pick it up. I would have had to drive the 40 minutes to pick it up and drive back if he didn't. So I called him and said, hey, Jake, I need it. And he gave the same excuse. And I said, just problem solve it. Figure it out. I need it. He said he'd have it back and I need it. And I knew I was going to pay the price, right? That's what people do when we set boundaries, is they punish us for them, right? We all do it sometimes. We all have it done to us sometimes. So Jake, about an hour later, comes through the front door of our house, I'm in the living room. He hangs, at that time it was in the living room. He hung the painting up on the wall. He knew I was right. He saw me, didn't say a word, and then walked out the door, got into his car, and drove home. And that was the price I paid. And there was no bad blood after that, of course. There can be, and people can hold grudges and punish us. But I realized when I was complaining to my wife that resentment was my problem. I was the one not executing my side of the contract, not letting him know there would be a consequence in relationship. But instead of dealing with the boundary and the punishment that I anticipated that I did get, I wanted to make my son the bad guy. Right? That's what I did. I talk about this when I talk about behavioral contracts, and they can be true in other kinds of contract where there's a mutual exchange of agreements. They won't do the work for you. I don't even care if it's written. To this day, as a professional working with parents and children, I have never seen a child, not once, seen a child violate a contract and say to his or her mother or father, you know what, you're right. It says clearly here not to do this behavior or there would be this consequence, and I've clearly violated the contract. So my consequence is deserved. Never once. Never once. They'll always find a loophole. They'll talk about the fact that they signed it under duress, right? That's the way that it goes. So we still have to do the work of boundaries. The contract can be helpful in the case of a behavioral contract if it gives you clarity, if it emboldens you, if you will, to follow through on the consequences that you've listed. But really don't expect it to be much easier in the exchange. Expect very little in that way. So you're still going to have to do the difficult work of boundary keeping. I started to allude to this early on in the broadcast. We learn as therapists in our very earliest training just the difference between explicit and implicit. You know, what is said and what is meant, what is really happening. If there wasn't confusion about these two or the mismatch, if everything that was implicit was explicit, we all wouldn't have the same arguments with each other for sometimes years. Right? The reason we have these same old arguments, we could almost put it on autoplay, is because we're not really getting at the root of it. That's why you go to a therapist, because he or she ideally could say, I'm hearing something here. I'm hearing something different. When there's a mismatch between the implicit, the covert, and the explicit or the overt in family systems in terms of what is said, what is meant, what the behavior is, when there's a mismatch, it's one of the most disconcerting feelings, one of the most upsetting feelings. That is why you can watch somebody say something to their child and the child will blow up. You could watch somebody say something to their spouse that as the videotape shows, doesn't look all that bad, but people have strong reactions to it, right? Because there's a history, there's a context. Something more is meant to it than meets the eye. So part of the goal in therapy, just as an aside, part of the goal is to find more and more connection between the explicit and the implicit, more and more alignment, more and more consistency, right? As I've gotten older, as I've become, and I still have a ways to go, right? And until I'm done, until I'm dead, I have that far to go. I I'm more able to talk about my insecurities. I'm more able to talk about my crap. And so now, more than when I was 41 or 31 or 21 or 11, I'm 51 now, somebody can ask me a question. And even if I've made a mistake, if I've lied, if I've tried to spin something, if I haven't been my best self, I'm more able to explain exactly what was going on. Like I was afraid. I was scared. I was hurt. I was lashing out. And I'm sorry. And as you all know, because you've had moments when somebody's responded to you that way, you've had moments when you've been able to respond that way. The more work, let me say this very clearly, the more work you do, that's what we talk about when I talk about doing your work, which is able to hold that kind of stuff. My therapist calls it your horrible, rotten self, your humanness. The more you're able to hold it, to talk about it, to become friends with it, and to share it with other people when it shows up, the easier it is for everybody to be around you. At the end of an in-service training this week with all of our therapists, I said at the very end, after talking about this idea of carrying around our insecurities, our horrible, rotten self, the things that we do that we're not proud of, but being able to carry it around, look at it, acknowledge it, become friends with it, and remain on speaking terms. The more we're able to do that, the better we'll be as partners, as family members, as parents, and as therapists. And so I said at the very end of it, you're all a mess. You're all a disaster. And everybody chuckled because of the context of the conversation. I said, but when you realize that, you're free. And it doesn't compromise your boundaries. It does just the opposite. They actually become more effortless because you're just doing it from a place of self, not from a place of insecurity or being right. So learning that you are taking when you are actually, when you say you are giving, is a big thing in relationships. The person who's initiating a conversation, right? If somebody has an issue, whether it be a parent or a child, and the person says, "Hey, I need to talk," the person initiating the conversation in general, these are not perfect, but in general, is the one doing the taking. The one being asked to listen is the one doing the giving. And we don't think about it that way. I see this in couples a lot. It's not always the case, but often it's the woman who's more verbal, right? Has more of an emotional vocabulary. That's not always the case, but it's more often the case than not. And when she initiates these discussions, she doesn't acknowledge, doesn't recognize that she's asking for something the entire time. You know, there's so much wonderful talk around vulnerability these days, right? That's one of the buzzwords. Brene Brown has made that word famous in pop culture. But being vulnerable is a taking thing. It's a risky thing, right? But you're asking for the other person to contain you, to hold space for you, to be kind to you, to not recoil in disgust or fear. So I think it's important that we understand that it's not as clear as we imagine. Initiating a difficult discussion is a taking thing, and saying I'll be there, I can listen, is a giving thing. And if we can all own that to make that process more explicit, then it becomes easier. If I know, because that's what it feels like, right? When my wife tells me a bunch of hard things about me, the children, her stress, even, she's asking me to carry her for a moment. We talk about this, she and I. I say, I just want you to be aware. This is. I'll give this to you, but it takes energy, and vice versa, vice versa. Um, if we don't make it explicit, I remember I had this father who had a very, very demanding job. And as we were discussing it, he was trying to make a case to his son of why he was doing this for his son, right? This is not a new conversation. Husbands and wives have this conversation, parents and children have this conversation. And I said to him, why don't you just thank your son for the sacrifice that he's making? You have a wonderful job. It's a really important job. And it takes away from his life a little bit also. And so if you can just thank him for that and acknowledge that, then there won't be this strange and kind of uncomfortable, maybe even painful mismatch, because you're trying to sell it as a gift to him. And while it does benefit his life in many ways, it also hurts his life in some ways too. And it's okay to talk about that. And again, that's teaching a father in this case to carry around his horrible, rotten self, the bad parts. It's called the bad object in self psychology, so that he doesn't make his son the bad one for being ungrateful or for being angry or upset. There is this idea in relationships. Somebody asked me this some time ago, if it was okay to need your spouse. And I responded to this person by saying, of course, we all need people, right? And there are times when I need things from my spouse and she from me. But don't confuse that with loving, because loving is a giving thing and needing is a taking thing, and they're not the same. They can happen in relationships nearly simultaneously, but it's not the same. That's why this is the phenomenal gem for parenting. That is why, if you need your kid to be okay so that you are okay, that's not love. Now, you may love your kid. Arguably, you love them more than anybody on planet Earth. But if you need them to be well so that you are okay, you are taking from them. That is why I teach all the time, go and get your needs taken care of somewhere else. And if you have a struggling child with addiction or a mental health issue, you need more resources. So you go to your Al-Anon meeting, you talk to your sponsor, you talk to your support group if you have one, you talk to your spouse or your co-parent if they are a support to you, you talk to your therapist. You vent there, you complain there, you stress out there. You do your best to leave it there. You can do it with meditation, other self-help, self-care, excuse me, activities and tools. But you take care of it over there so that when you show up to this child who's not an adult, not even the older ones, right? Not even the 20-something-year-olds, who's not a fully grown adult, your exchange with them is not in the service of taking care of you. If you don't take care of yourself, if you don't realize, as they say in Al-Anon, that your serenity is your responsibility, if you don't understand that and own that, you will take. You will take from somebody who's already depleted, somebody who's already self-medicating with some kind of symptom to manage their pain and turmoil. And now they're leaving high and dry, right? Starving, thirsting, the person who loves them the most. So when we think about mental health, we get very clear about what it is to give and what it is to receive, what it is to love and what it is to need, and the parallels between those things. Giving love, loving that giving thing, it comes from a place of abundance. I say you have to fill up your belly spiritually, emotionally. If you don't fill up your belly emotionally and spiritually, you don't have anything to give. That's why self-care is so important. When it comes from a place of abundance, the question is, what can I do for you? How can I support you? What do you need? And then you ask yourself, can I give it to you without compromising what I need and with my core values, my core sense of self? And you get to answer that question. But to be clear, as we all develop a practice of healthy and adequate self-care, we can be more of a resource to our family members, particularly our children. Right? That's one of the goals. And so the foundation is you have something to give. Energy, time, space, love. I want to talk about containing. Containing is it's a therapeutic term that means like holding space is kind of the new age phrase of it, but it means that I can sit with you. You know, when I say it flippantly, I say holding somebody's crazy. And I'll say to my wife, can you hold my crazy right now? Because I want to vent. And I'm going to say some things that are going to be irrational, that aren't going to make sense, that I'm sure you're going to have the simplest of solutions. Can you contain me right now? It comes from a famous psychologist named Melanie Klein, the idea of being a container. Holding my crazy, my irrational, horrible, neurotic self. It's an unconscious and automatic experience. I talk about this all the time with my therapist. You are at times asking people to contain you when you walk in the room and you sigh loudly. Right? It's automatic. You're asking the other people to tolerate you. And the joke is, and I mean it differently than is meant when we talk commonly. But really what I'm describing is, can people tolerate me? Really me. And all of my imperfections. Now, I'm pretty easy to tolerate when I'm on. When I'm full, when I'm giving, when I'm rational, when I'm demonstrating all this capacity that I've been working on in my meditation, my therapy, whatever it is, I'm really easy to tolerate. But that's only a fraction of the time. The other fraction of the time, I'm hard to tolerate. And do I recognize that? And do I recognize that if somebody can't tolerate me, which means they can't listen, they have to go take care of themselves, they have to stop the conversation, do I punish them? Do I make them bad? That's called externalizing the bad object. That's what that means. Do I make that other person the villain because my needs aren't getting taken care of? Or do I just see that person as a person with limitations? And can I own that I'm not always easy? I'm a lot. We all are. And containing children is a primary responsibility for parents. It's not the same. Children are not to contain the parents. That's why I talk about this careful idea about sharing feelings with your children the same way I would ask children to share parents' feelings with the parents. They can't hold them. They just can't. It doesn't work that way. It's overwhelming. It's crushing. You occupy a different space in your children's mind and their psyche than they in yours, ideally, unless you haven't unwound some of the narcissistic wounds of your own, which is true for some of us. That's what this work, that's what I'm talking about and trying to help with all the time. When we do place a child, one of our children, in the same space, if you will, that a parent should be or should have been, we're recreating the narcissistic wound in them. And that's the wound of not being seen, not being held, not being contained. That's why I talk about this idea. How we think about our children is how what they will think about themselves. How we think and feel about them. It's not what we say that becomes their inner voice. It's how we think and feel about them that becomes their inner voice. And again, it's unconscious and automatic. That is why, even though you may never have said I was disappointed or frightened or angry or agitated or frustrated or whatever it is to your child, but if you felt it, that gets internalized by the child as something's wrong with me. That is child development psychology. That is not what lay people believe and what pop psychologists talk about and teach. And it is not conscious, and it takes a while to see it. I'm going to say it again. When you, mom or dad, get angry, frustrated, agitated, disappointed, frightened even, the psychological interpretation of a child is something's wrong with me. Not you, me, the child. That is child psychology. So again, we go back to taking care of ourselves so they don't have to. Right? We go back to the idea that when you have a child struggling with anxiety or depression or substance abuse disorder or an eating disorder, you need extra help from other people. That's half of what Evoke is about. That's half of why we do. That's why we do all of this extra work. Not to blame, but to give you something, to give you information, support, connection, to let you know that I'm in it with you, that I do everything that I talk to you about. And I'm more aware of it now than I was 20 years ago when I started this. When we ask somebody to contain us, we're asking, can you just listen to me? Not correct me. I don't need an expert. The tenets of containing are, don't be an expert. I remember one time I was doing supervision with my therapist. I take some of my cases to my therapist. And I was working with a family, and the parent, they were in the proverbial rock, between the rock and the hard place. They were asking tough questions about decisions with one of their children. And I remember saying to my therapist, I don't know what to tell them. And she said, good, keep it that way. And then I remembered she was right. I don't know the answer. I don't have the solution, the silver bullet. Took the pressure off. And I immediately transformed my relationship toward the client and their problems. And so I could just be there for them. And by the way, I say this, I teach this all the time to clients. I teach them all the time. We must be very careful as therapists, not to violate our ethical code, which says we are not to give advice in areas of major life decisions. And you know, we can make recommendations. We can talk about the pros and cons, but if we start to talk about you should, we get into some trouble because that's a violation of our ethics in some way. So we say this is the, you know, that's why I say in the book, The Journey of the Rogue Parent, I talk to our therapists all the time. Teach the parents the pros and cons. Teach them why they're making the decision. I would always say to my clients, I don't confront your decision. I confront the why. I'm allowed to talk about that. If it's coming from a place of fear or insecurity, anger, control, Let's talk about that because it's hard to get it right if it comes from those places. If it comes from a place of wisdom and love and trust and authenticity and clarity, it's hard to get it wrong, right? So not being the expert, and the expert, I teach this to therapists. We are experts, but not on your life. We are experts at creating a situation, a context, a process that helps you find your life, find yourself, find your truth. I'm going to say that again. Therapists are not experts on your life. Therapists ought to be experts on creating a process where you discover your truth. And my therapist says it very simply. She says, reminds me every once in a while when she's doing supervision with me, she says, you don't know somebody else's truth. I can't pick your religion. I can't pick your spouse. I can't pick your career, right? I can't pick the food that you like, the clothes that you want to wear, the sports you want to play, so forth and so on. Learn to feel better. You know, Maya Angelou gets credited with the idea that if I knew better, I would do better. And that absolutely has a part in the equation. But what I say often is if I felt better, I would do better. If I did as well as I know, man, I'd be walking on water half the time. I've been studying this stuff for 25 plus years, 30 years, right? If you have to study as much as I do to get it right, you got to quit your job and enter into a career in therapy and parent coaching for 30 years. But that doesn't ensure that I don't make mistakes. I make plenty of mistakes every day, all the time. My limitations are constantly on display in this family. But I learn to feel better. And when I feel better, when I feel okay, when my belly is full spiritually and emotionally, I do better. I'm better dad, better therapist. I was joking today. I had dental work done today, so you might notice my mouth with a little strange movement tonight. But I was at the very end. My dentist did an amazing job. It was kind of an emergency. I didn't have a lot of time, and he did it really fast, and he did a great job. And I said that was perfect. And his assistant joked with him, teased him, and said, "Don't tell him that; it'll go to his head." And I said, "Believe me, if there's anything I want, it's my dentist to feel confident and good about himself, right?" People will say that when they give me a compliment sometimes. They'll say, "I don't want to let it go to your head." And my response is, look, if I feel good about myself, that's what you want. You don't want me feeling bad about myself as your therapist, because then the things that I do are going to be in the service of my ego. You don't want me as your husband or your father or your friend to be insecure, ideally, right? If you could choose. You want me to feel secure. You want me to feel good about myself, because when I feel good about myself, I'm kind, loving, non-judgmental, non-competitive, patient, supportive, and so on. Feeling better is your job, not your child's. There's a great talk. I wrote about this in my new book about Will Smith, where he talks about where he and Jada Pinkett Smith, his wife, decided at some point in their marriage that they were going to get happy and come to the marriage happy, not come to each other with their hands out begging for the other person to make them happy. So your feeling better is your responsibility. And it took me a lot of years, decades, to realize that nobody was going to rescue me but me. And I kept looking for those around me and was angry and resentful at the people that were mistreating me because it was their job, or at least the people standing next to them or beside me, to protect me. And then I realized I had to leave. I had to walk away from that situation, from that relationship, to be okay. Watch out for a cutoff or enmeshment, right? It's the other side of the same coin. Being too close, as they say, it's not really, it's a euphemism, because too close is actually abandonment. Too close is over identification. That's why I say that being overly attached is not a real thing. It's a semantics problem. Being anxiously engaged as a parent is not too much love. It's not enough self. I want to be clear about that. Anxiety in a relationship doesn't come from love. It's the opposite. It's fear. Anxiety is synonymous virtually with fear, which is the opposite of love. And yet we have this culture where we talk about you're only as happy as your least happy child, and anxious mothers and fathers just love too much. I understand the need not to shame, but it'd be better if we could just all realize we're just kind of, the outcome of therapy. I wrote this the other day. The outcome of therapy, the outcome of being in a relationship that's wonderful, is that you realize that you're a disaster and a miracle all at the same moment, right? That you're just a person. The name of the next book out soon is called The Audacity to Be You, what it means to be a self and love another. Just you. And it's beautiful, and it's a disaster, and it's a mess. Being a self is a mess, but it's wonderful and beautiful at the same time. Watch out for control. Things like fixing, alleviating, solving, dismissing, or discounting, or changing the other. It's why therapy is a different context, folks. It's why real therapy is not fixing clients. Real therapy is seeing clients, understanding clients. And in that context, they fix, quote unquote, themselves. But I try to remind myself all the time, don't fix them. Don't fix them. It feels horrible when someone's trying to fix you, but it feels wonderful when they're trying to understand you. And remember, that takes capacity to understand. Somebody asked me years ago, they said, aren't some parents just asses? And I said, I'm a therapist. I really don't have that inclination, or that I don't have that luxury to think of people as just asses. I just don't. It wouldn't work. I couldn't do my job. And she was saying, yeah, but just tell me the truth. And I was saying, no, it's not how I think. I see people as having broken, hurt parts inside of them. And the way that they're protecting them ends up hurting other people, right? Hurt people, right? And so if I can help them to heal through love and nurturing and understanding and empathy, and if they can heal, they don't act out anymore. That's the idea. That's the difference between the therapeutic lens and other lenses that focus on control. That's why there's so much talk on planet Earth since the beginning of time about good and bad, right and wrong, and evil. Because those words tend to have the effect to control other people, right? Whereas in therapy, you don't try to control. You just talk about, you don't say a broken leg is a bad leg. You say a broken leg is a broken leg. You don't say a narcissist is a bad person. You say a narcissist is somebody who's injured, who's defending themselves in this way that hurts other people, mostly themselves. What we learn to do in this work, what I'm learning to do, what I'm trying to share with you, is we learn to tolerate each other's rotten self and still hold boundaries. And the two needn't conflict or compromise each other. Like I said earlier, the parent's primary responsibility is to contain the child. Similar to a therapist, right? To an ideal. If we're talking about the ideal parental role, therapist role, it's to contain somebody. If we can learn to carry around our own horrible, rotten self, then our children won't have to. That's a big deal. It's a really, really important thing. This is the way self-psychologists would say it if they were talking to you. They would say, if you can be bad, if you can learn, as Carl Jung said, to own the bad parts, the parts you've been taught were bad, then your children won't have to carry those things around, right? That's what Carl Jung meant when he said, I would rather be whole than good. The things that we were taught about ourselves that are quote unquote bad aren't bad. Some of them are underdeveloped. Some of them are wounds and symptoms that cover up the wounds, right? Some of them are just the edges of our limitations. That's just what they are. This containing, this loving, that I'm describing, it requires self-care on the part of the parent and a strong sense of self. That is why I say, now that you've got your child safe in our program or somewhere else, when they're safe, when you've set the boundary that you can, there's nothing more than you could do for your child in this world than to do some really good, strong work on yourself. Which, by the way, blesses your life, first of all, benefits you, makes you happier. But then you have something to give to them. And it's not a taking thing anymore. I said this earlier, children can't contain parents without compromising their real or authentic self. It's just the way that it works. The references for that are the drama, The Gifted Child. You can listen to the podcast. I rethought about today about the series, the 2-book series, The Knight in Rusty Armor, that's a bestseller, sold millions of copies. And then the sequel that my therapist wrote called The Letters of Juliet to the Knight in Rusty Armor. If you read those in that order or listen to the podcasts or webinars in that order, you'll hear this thing that I'm talking about, this containing thing. But children are not peers. Children are not spouses. They're not siblings. They're not friends, acquaintances. Children are a different animal, right? It's why when people say, that children, for example, shouldn't get participation trophies, they should early on. They should early on. We're rewarding them for participating. How many of us avoid participating because it's frightening? We're afraid of failure. We reward participation early. Now, later on, those things can go away. But children aren't mini adults, and sometimes we think they are. And we have to be smart about it. And part of being smart about it is realizing that you don't tell your children how you feel to get them to change their behavior. You don't tell them how you feel with the implication that they need to behave, do differently, get rid of their anxiety or their cutting or their drug use so that you're now happy. That's not how it works. And yet, virtually, that's what most lay messages are for generations. That's what we were told, right? We were told that if mom and dad are upset, you're doing something wrong. If mom and dad are happy and proud, you're doing something right. Not true. Not the moral North Star that we think it is. Harmful, counterintuitive, but it's harmful. Partners, friends, siblings take turns and are evenly matched in containing, right? My wife and I take turns containing each other. And those days when both of us are empty, those are not great days. The days when both of us are full, those are beautiful days. The days when one of us is empty and one of us is full, those days work well also. Intimacy requires the ability to contain. Like I said earlier, there's this movement because of some of the pop psychologists that are out there, the self-helpers that talk about vulnerability and sharing and letting down your guard. All important, all wonderful parts of this thing we call intimacy. And intimacy can be between two lovers, to a couple, between siblings, between parent and child. So intimacy doesn't have to be just romantic, just closeness. And intimacy can only exist in a relationship to the extent that there's not control. That's why I talk about with my therapist all the time. I say, you guys, you have a lot of control over your clients. You have control over recommendations to their parents, length of stay, recommendations for aftercare. You have to recognize that. Because to the extent you don't name it, talk about it, acknowledge it, you don't really do the best therapy. Same with us as parents. We have to recognize the power and control that we have over our children. If when they're younger, it's legal control and power, and when it's older, it might be financial until a certain point. One of the greatest things, and a lot of you say, I want this to happen sooner rather than later. What would happen if they were awarded millions of dollars? Would they have a relationship with you? If they were emancipated and had $10 million in their bank account, would they come over and talk to you? Would they want you in their life? These are things to begin to think about. I always talk about with parents. Intimacy requires two selves, so that the quality of the intimacy is based on the extent of each partner's self-development. That means you. That means your self-awareness, your self-care, your sense of self, is a predictor, not the only predictor, but a predictor of the intimacy, of the closeness in your relationship with your child. And then the other part of the equation is the same in them, their self-awareness, right? Their self-development. Parents must have a strong sense of self to be able to provide a safe and adequate container. People will say to me, so I just have to let people walk on me, and I say, no, no, no. You don't become a doormat. You become a strong sense of self with healthy boundaries. And the more you do self-work, the wider your bandwidth becomes. The gift a parent gives to the child is their strong sense of self. I can't say it enough. If you want to change you and your child's life, if you've already done Evoke, or if your child's at Evoke now, go to an intensive. Doesn't have to be with us. You can call our admissions staff and ask for somebody else's intensives. There are others across the country, several of them. Do your own work. Go to Al-Anon. Go to therapy. Discover your childhood. Discover what you don't know about yourself. That's the greatest gift you can give to your child. Like I said, many are clear these days on the principle of vulnerability, but few are clear on the other side of the equation. The other side is giving, the giving side. We call the other side the container. That is, they hold space for the other, right? So when these self-help books and gurus talk about becoming vulnerable, that's part of it. That's a hard part of it. But maybe the harder part of it is the person receiving. Because intimacy, I teach this to couples all the time. Intimacy is not warm and fuzzy usually. It's really painful and scary. It means, this is important, especially as parents. And I'm going to say this so slowly and emphatically because I can't emphasize it too much. Intimacy is not always warm and fuzzy. It means that people tell us when we hurt them. I should say hurt them. It means that people tell us when we hurt them and when they are angry with us, and we welcome it and we listen to them. That's the hard part of intimacy. After an exchange between two people, you can tell the person who was doing the giving and who was doing the receiving, who was doing the taking and who was doing the giving. And this is what it feels like. And for those of you that are in or have been in a intimate partnership with a spouse or a partner, you'll recognize this. The one that needs a little bit of distance, they were the giver. They were the listener. They might need a moment. The one that now feels like a gush of love, that was the taker. Okay? And that one that feels like the gush of love and feels closer, it's often because they didn't say the warmest and fuzziest things. They said some hard things. So if you're on the receiving end of that and you feel like you need a little space, and I'm not talking about punishing. I'm not talking about, getting back at the other person, but it took something out of you. And I don't think we recognize that. And that's true of mom and dad and son or daughter or child, right? Excuse me. It's important to recognize that at the end of an exchange, the one that's happier and lighter, probably the one that's done most of the talking and venting, that's been the person who's been taking. And the person who's been listening and containing is a little bit colder and a little bit more distant. That's the one that's been giving. What gets in the way of our listening? We make it about us. We still haven't healed our own narcissistic wounds from childhood. We need to be good, right? We can't be the bad object. It was never modeled to us, right? So if you respond with anything other than patience, curiosity, and listening, that's where your walls are up. Over-identifying with the child, seeing the child as an extension of you. Again, another evidence of our own narcissistic wound. Low pain tolerance. That could be true of anybody. Asking the other to resolve your anxiety, right? I say this because I think it's a visceral example that people can feel. If you start sharing me something you're struggling with or something you've done, and my response is to gasp like a visible, audible, you know one thing, you know I'm not safe. So you don't want to have to take care of me when you're the one that's sharing the trauma. Parents are wired and socialized to be the protector and the fixer, right? That's how we see our identity. It's bad programming. It makes you the taker, ironically, in a weird way that will make sense to you the more work that you do. But it's bad programming. In co-therapy, one of the reasons why co-therapy, why by having a second therapist present works is because I can go unconscious a little bit and the other therapist can stay conscious. It's like I can go underwater and they can be the lifeguard. And so that's why you use somebody who can be your quote unquote co-therapist. Ideally, it's your co-parent, but that's often can't be the case. So then you find a therapist or a sponsor, somebody who's been down the road a little bit farther than you to be the lifeguard, to let you kind of figure it out, to help you. And I want to say this, I have an advantage as a therapist over you with your children. They're not my children. You could contain and listen to my children. You could watch them in pain. Many of you, easier than I could. And you could tolerate it and be there for them in a way that's for them and not for you. I struggle more than that with my own children. With your children, I have that capacity because I don't have all of the over-identification problems, right? I always say that the worst sound in the world is not a child crying. The worst sound in the world is your child crying. So what are the take-homes tonight? Self-care and self-awareness will predict whether you are able to give anything to another. Giving and taking often look alike to those who struggle with codependency. They cannot tell the difference. Resentment is often a symptom of poor boundaries and poor self-care. If you're angry at others, consider the fact that you might not be setting healthy boundaries and you're just expecting them to do it. Do it the way you would do it. Many don't consider how much and when they are asking for something. If you're thinking about gifts, Evoke is a gift this year. Evoke is a gift. Your work, you being on this broadcast tonight live or listening to the podcast in our library, that's your gift to your child. Do your work. Nothing you can do will bless them more than that. Doing your work, owning your stuff, doing your work, owning your stuff, making your amends, apologizing, and understanding your child is the greatest gift you can give to them this holiday season, or any season for that matter. Increasing your bandwidth is the best thing you can do to contribute to your child's well-being, and it comes through self-development. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions. A few have come in. Somebody says, thanks for helping us. You should also make a list of the top 200 therapists nationwide, because otherwise we have a major challenge to find them. This is true. Somebody asks, how did we get here? Every opportunity in the world, and our 15-year-old is on his second pass through in Mid-Coast, Maine. Would parents have kids if they knew it would be so challenging? Of course it's challenging. And it's important to understand why you got here. You know, it reminds me of this. You've met people who have married and divorced an absolute disaster, at least in their opinion, right? A narcissist or a borderline. And it's important that they get out of that abusive relationship. But an important question is, why did you marry a borderline? Why did you marry a narcissist, right? That's the most important question. And I don't mean that as a shaming question. So how did you get here? Perfect question. That's your job to answer. And your child, that's his or her job to tell you. But you got to develop ears to hear it. And it takes a while. Someone says, thanks for the feeling better aspect, because We as parents are really hurting, but still finding beauty every day. It's a long journey. Um, Someone asked why are there so many programs in Utah. It's just kind of they all grew out of the same early ones, right? The first wilderness therapy programs were here. So it kind of happened that way. We have really good public land. That's where wilderness therapy is. The licensing is friendly to parent rights in Utah, whereas some more liberal states empower younger and younger children, so they can't place their child in a program. Some parent asks, what do you think of the term leverage? Is it just another way of saying control? I hear this word often in the context of parents dealing with troubled young adults, especially those with addiction. That's a great question. Um, be careful with it. Get feedback about it. It can be controlling. Leverage can be exercised and probably ought to be exercised when the risk is really great, right? There's no bad reason to save somebody's life. But if it becomes a theme, right? If it becomes a go-to too much, if it becomes a central aspect of the dynamic in the relationship, intimacy is lost. So it's something that's why you have to talk to other people. I remember having to shift from a leverage model with my oldest to a more open model because I was asked by my therapist back then, 10 years ago, what do you want? What do you want with your son? And I said, I want to be a resource to him. And I want to be able to talk to him and listen to him. And she said, keep that in mind when you're making your decisions. So I let go of some of the leverage and it opened up, changed the relationship dramatically. And not long after that, he got sober and has been since 9 years, 10 years. So it's a great question. Be careful of it. I love the TED Talk by Johan Hari on addiction and connection. And it's not because I think it gives you an absolute answer to the question, but if you haven't seen it, you can just Google Johan Hari, Hari, I think, or addiction and connection TED Talk, or Rat Park, like the animal Rat Park TED Talk. Any of those will get you to the TED Talk. Watch the 15-minute TED Talk and ask about the implications. Ask yourself about the implications. Again, it doesn't give you advice. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it does ask for some considerations that I think when we lean on leverage too much, get lost. Someone says, let's see, having issues with your own parents because they're from a different time, do those get noticed or repeated by your own kids? History repeating itself? Sure. Yeah, we're all passing down the dents from previous generation, and we're hoping to make a slight improvement, right? That's the goal, to just make some improvement, to grow. And part of what our children are saying to us is, this context isn't working for me, right? I don't fit in this model. And so they act out of it. That's what's happening. All right, let me go over upcoming announcements, and then I'll leave just a little bit of time for any last questions. Our next parent workshop is at our Utah location, Entrada, in 2020, January 25th and 26th. We ask all current parents, if possible, to go to it. You can combine that with a visit to your child if the therapist says the timing is right. RSVP or ask for more information by emailing melanie@evoketherapy.com. I'll announce our parent support groups coming up. The intensives that I was describing, we have some spots left open in January still, January 8th through 12th. This is, in my opinion, the best way. And again, email us at intensives@evoketherapy.com. Reach out to our admissions folks. And if you don't want to do ours, do somebody else's, right? It's not about filling our spaces. It's about doing the work. We also have customized intensive for couples, families, professionals, and individuals. Go to our website or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. Pursuits trips are outdoor trips, activities throughout the world. These are, think of therapy light, sober fun, customized trip. Any kind of activity, can be parent and child, family, can be a young adult. We ask all parents to attend 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous. You can go to adultchildren.org to find out about adult children of alcoholics, or just think of adult children of really not healthy families. Alateen is for teens, refugerecovery.org. That's an organization that helps, that also is a support group for addictive behaviors and codependency. It's Buddhist inspired, less of an emphasis on a higher power if that's a barrier for you. And you can also go to NAMI.org, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, for free resources in your local chapter. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app, on your iPhone or iOS device. On an Android device, use the SoundCloud app, or on your web browser, go to soundcloud.com. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs using the handle @EvokeTherapy. Or on Instagram, you can find the Summit Lodge, that's our intensive program, by using @Evoke Summit Lodge. Find us on Facebook by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. The Alumni Foundation, an organization of parents to help give back, you can find on Facebook by searching Evoke Family Foundation. And then, of course, our blog on our website. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available and recommended on Amazon. There's also an Audible version there. Anytime you go to the website, if you go through the Amazon Smiles program and you choose the Evoke Family Foundation, a percentage of proceeds goes to that organization to help people who cannot afford therapy. Looks like I don't have any other live questions that have come up. I will send out an announcement tomorrow for our next broadcast. Like I always say, for and on behalf of your child, thank you for joining the broadcast. Thank you for joining this evening. Take care, folks. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.